I'm a PhD student at Carnegie Mellon University in the Tepper School of Business, specifically the Organizational Behavior and Theory program, and grateful to the organizers, co-presenters, et cetera, for the really rich conference that's existed so far. One of the aims of my work here that I'm sharing about today is to contribute to our understanding, right, of trust and trustworthiness within the realm specifically of social valuation and evaluation. And I hope to do so by examining the effect platform design interventions have on the perceived trustworthiness of performance ratings in work environments and consider a possible mechanism by which this effect operates. So work, as we know, is increasingly performed in digitally and algorithmically mediated contexts, and the efficacy of any tool or material technology adopted in work contexts is a function of the social structures within which it is embedded and the interactions they facilitate. Increases in virtuality and decreases in organizational hierarchy raise particularly challenging questions about the ways in which embodiment, technology, and human practices might be entangled in work of all types. And this is especially true for workers in the alternative or gig economy. This research that I'm sharing today was funded in part by the AI Caring Grant, an NSF-funded grant, and the goal of which is to develop the next generation of personalized collaborative AI systems that improve the quality of life and independence of aging adults living at home. Grounding our research in the network of care providers invested in the supportive home care of adults living with mild cognitive impairment. So I wanted to spend a minute or two just discussing or referencing this context as it serves to ground several of my studies. They're not the only nation in which this is the case. The US population is aging, and with this comes a host of new societal challenges. While informal caregivers, typically family, are the most ubiquitous members of in-home caregiving teams here, direct care workers serve a critical role in coordinating patient care. From the Raise Family Caregivers Act initial report here to the US Congress in 2021, you can see the quote, "If family caregivers are the backbone of the long-term services and support systems, with appropriate support, connections, and resources, paid caregivers are the connective tissue." And that's really who I'm focusing on or imagining in the context of this research, that paid caregiver that might be the backbone of this system. Yet even though they're the backbone, the median turnover rate for paid home caregivers in the same year, 2021, was 64.9%, a number that is in fact the second lowest that rate had been in the previous 6 years. So this is just one example of contemporary work environments marked by exceedingly high turnover of individuals, often contracted through temporary or otherwise precarious employment arrangements. That's while aspects of my experiment might generalize to broader context, gig work provides a relevant context for theoretically grounding an examination of trust and design in the context of algorithmic systems. At this point in time, I haven't really talked much about algorithms yet, but in reality, a lot of alternative and independent work is in fact platform mediated work, which is where I'll be headed. So alternative work arrangements defined broadly as independent contracting, online platform work, contract form work, on-call work, and temporary work, a term I'll use roughly interchangeably with gig work, has recently been estimated to define the primary job for an estimated 29% of all US workers. This is an undeniably large segment of today's working population. I don't think it's exclusive to the US, but my statistics are kind of grounded here for the presentation purpose today, but hopefully it translates. And while the parameters of this distinction, alternative work, is in part arbitrary, right? It's possible to imagine a self-employed software engineer who has more in common with an organizational employee, possibly one who's working at will virtually, than a rideshare driver. But the designation is one that can be clearly defined and is in fact marked by differences. For instance, access to unemployment, organizational policy protections, employee benefits, et cetera. And gig work occurs inherently outside organizational structures, free of managerial oversight. And it's in these contexts, job design does not take place through carefully crafted descriptions and recurring performance reviews. In fact, the very nature of contract work precludes, at least by law in the US, true job design interventions. Nonetheless, individuals in the gig economy increasingly rely on digital platforms to coordinate their work. And these platforms are heavily designed For these workers, then, it no longer makes sense to ask the extent to which managers or coworkers let you know how well you are doing on your job, because for gig workers, coworkers and managers don't technically exist in many cases. In the gig economy, digital platforms may be the only direct connection workers have to the clients who pay them and the organizations that coordinate their jobs. This work is only and always mediated by the digital platform. And for others who are employed by organizations but engaged in digitally mediated work, coworkers and supervisors likely exist, but it's entirely plausible that one might be more closely tied to a platform than to these other people. The question of how to encourage persistence and performance among workers then shifts, at least in part, from the design of the job to the design of the platform. Moreover, uncertainty and vulnerability, two necessary conditions for trust to emerge, as we've heard at times here, are particularly salient features of extra-organizational work, meriting thus further investigation into trust and trustworthiness. So for this specific study, we looked into how the relative richness of information provided in job training or online digital work platforms, as well as the feedback delivered throughout work tasks, might contribute to a range of factors affecting internal motivation and the implications therein on workers' trust of performance ratings, and by extension, their relationship to their occupation, work platform, or employer. And I find that changes to the information delivered in an online work platform affect the trustworthiness ascribed to an algorithmically determined performance rating. And I provide evidence that this effect is mediated through what I'm going to call rating surprise. So while rating surprise might be a new term for some, we heard at least one mention of the role surprise can play in trust during yesterday's talks. And I think it could make sense for many of us if we take a moment to imagine a corollary experience with similar intuition, that of grade surprise, from which I'm drawing from a presentation of Robinson et al. 2021. So imagine a situation in which a hypothetical student receives adequate but not great grades in two different courses at the end of a term. In one course, the professor established clear expectations for evaluation. The student received regular feedback throughout the term, and the final term grade was reflective of their work. In the second course, the student might have had little opportunity to receive feedback on their work. The evaluative framework for the final term grade seemed discrepant with the professor's instruction. While these two grades are generally accepted, while these two grades are equal, and while grades are generally accepted to be positively correlated with a range of important outcomes, satisfaction, motivation, persistence, it seems altogether possible that the student might ascribe different levels of trustworthiness to these grades despite their equivalent values. And so drawing on that idea of grade surprise, again from Robinson, thinking of, does this translate, this idea of surprise, a very real human experience? Does it affect potentially how individuals perceive in a work context the trustworthiness of an automated rating? Algorithmic ratings can lead to negative surprise when individuals receive ratings or recommendations they perceive as unjust or illegitimate, an effect that could be related to the relative transparency of the system underlying these ratings. While this wasn't the primary focus of the study cited here by one of the organizers, I drew this from a paper in which they talked about transparency, perhaps reducing the negative surprise that individuals are experiencing. And another here that's kind of pointing towards legitimacy more so, which might get a little bit to our broad question from this morning around whether or not trust does in fact matter. Are there other proxies that might be more accurate? People tend to find decisions they disagree with acceptable to obey if the decision procedure meets certain normative conditions, right? Kind of drawing on proceduralism here in political theory or political philosophy. Thus, there's an important theoretical questions about the conditions that an algorithmic procedure must satisfy for its decision output to be such that stakeholders should accept it. So now to this specific simulation platform that you see a screenshot of here. You're going to hear a little bit more about this from my colleague, I think, after me. But I'll touch on this kind of novel platform that we developed in order to examine the effects of pre-task and in-task interventions on the trustworthiness of an automated performance rating delivered in a simulated work context. And so we refer to this as Turto, the small digital pet there. I'm not sure if Tamagotchis were like a thing that existed, but these digital pets from like decades ago, it's Similar idea, but a platform that simulates an online work context in which participants act as caregivers for a digital animal. In this specific experiment, study participants were randomly assigned to one cell of a 2x2 between subjects study, varying task uncertainty and the level of in-task feedback individuals received. We recruited 162 English-speaking US citizens on Prolific. Of these, 20 participants failed to complete the full study or experienced technical issues preventing full data collection, and 2 remaining participants were excluded for failed attention checks, leaving 140 participants in the sample. And following assignment to the treatment condition, participants received an introduction that situated them first as part of a caregiving team, providing around-the-clock care for an animal. And after this introduction, they engaged with a training tutorial, orienting them to the simulated work environment before completing the 7-minute work task in this platform. Following the caregiving simulation, participants completed a brief attention check before receiving an overall rating of their task performance. You can see the detail that would have been provided and then populated with the actual performance rating based on their activity within the simulated work task. And in the last stage of the experiment, participants responded to a survey measuring the variables of interest. And so I'll describe now our 2 manipulations. In the first conditions, participants received one of 2 versions of instructions before beginning the 7-minute work task. Instructions were designed to manipulate the task uncertainty in the simulation in the high uncertainty treatment group. Participants received vague instructions you can see on the screen there. For instance, Turto needs to be fed snack pellets regularly. And in the low uncertainty treatment group, participants received detailed instructions for addressing Turto's hunger, health, and cleanliness there. Feeding snack pellets every minute on the minute. For instance, 1 minute, 2 minute, 3 minute, etc. Similarly for health and cleanliness. In the second condition, we varied whether individuals received automated in-task feedback designed to improve their internal knowledge of results. Knowledge of results here is defined as the degree to which an employee or worker knows and understands on a continuous basis how effectively they perform their job. So for participants receiving treatment in this condition, the platform included a responsive dashboard in the upper left corner of the simulation window. Diagrammed here, shown here, provided real-time indications of Turto's current hunger, health, and cleanliness throughout the 7-minute task. And the indication would vary in the following ways. You can see kind of health, unhealthy, changing the star rating and the text, depending on Turto's status on a given dimension. And for participants in the control group, the status dashboard was disabled and their direct knowledge was limited to changes in Turto's appearance. For instance, Turto's eyes might grow large, might change in color, might begin to spin or act erratically in the task. Performing manipulation checks suggests that both conditions successfully did what we had intended them to do. So a 2x2 ANOVA revealed a significant main effect, the clarity of pre-task expectations on task uncertainty. There was no significant interaction and no direct effect from from knowledge of results, or sorry, the in-task feedback conditions. So that's on the left there. On the right, our manipulation check for knowledge of results, similarly a 2x2 ANOVA, revealed a significant main effect of the in-task feedback dashboard on knowledge of results, and participants receiving automated in-task feedback in the form of a status dashboard experienced improved knowledge of results. So all this, right, these manipulations to see our primary dependent variable in this case, or outcome, is trustworthiness measure. And so I'll talk a little bit about those measures here for a moment, which is probably what the whole talk could be about given our context here, which ones we selected. And as we've heard throughout the conference proceedings, right, there's little consensus at times, accepting whatever conclusions we've already arrived at this morning's sessions on the most appropriate way for measuring trust or trustworthiness. Now, the Meyer et al. 1995 three-dimensional measure that's been brought up by several of the presenters is the dominant paradigm in the management field. But I was reluctant about using it here, maybe unconvinced of its appropriateness to the specific study. For one, I've increasingly seen sort of presentations of emerging work in which researchers include all 3 dimensions for analysis, but raise questions about whether there's any difference in their predictive relevance across those 3 dimensions. Second, I was skeptical that a measure originally designed to assess human trust in top management teams was altogether relevant for this experiment, right? We've already talked about translating trust in humans to trust in AIs or robots, but in this case, it's something far less anthropomorphic. It's simply an automated rating. So then kind of my goal was to find a measure that was assessing something similar in terms of trustworthiness. So two measures that seemed to fit, Thielsch and Hirschfeld included a three-item measure looking at the trust dimension of credibility. Participants responded also in this experiment to a single item measure from Lee 2018. That was simply the algorithmic calculation provided an accurate overall rating of my caregiving performance. While the results I'll display were based off of the three-item measure, there was no significant difference in direction or magnitude from results based just on the single item measure. And while I feel that these measures are appropriate for the experiment as designed, broadly, I'm interested in exploring further work aimed at standardizing measures of trust across studies and fields, as has been talked. Perhaps the conversations already raised at this conference are suggestive that items or ideas or concepts, I guess, concepts such as credibility, reliability, or legitimacy might in some cases be more relevant than trust or trustworthiness. Perhaps better predictors of trust behaviors. That was a challenge that was raised yesterday, is why does trust attitude frequently fail to predict or mediate the relationship of trust behaviors? But something I'm not passing judgment on now, just ideas. This idea of rating surprise, right? So there's a several item measure I didn't use. I used a single item. In this case, I was surprised at the performance rating I received. The two related items were included to help confirm this measure. Participants reported their expected rating before they actually received their performance rating. Then we compared those after the fact, and they reported, along with their response to the rating surprise measure, how the actual rating compared. Was it higher than, lower than, or equivalent to their expected rating? And for the performance, it was they received an overall rating, an overall score that ranged from 0, fails to meet expectations, to 3, exceeds expectations. And this was a simple average of ratings on 3 categories of interest: hunger, health, and cleanliness. And the individual category ratings were based on the amount of time it took participants to provide, scheduled feedings or resolve changes in Turto's appearance and behavior. A 2x2 ANOVA revealed a significant main effect of the task uncertainty manipulation, so the pre-task instructions on the trustworthiness of the rating, in which participants in the low task uncertainty treatment perceive the performance rating to be more trustworthy. However, there was no significant main effect on the actual in-task feedback. This interaction plot is suggestive of something, but these error bars are actually pretty large, so there was also no significant interaction. But I think it's maybe an area for future study, especially because we have another analysis on a similar experiment that is a little bit clear that there could be an interaction between, or is an interaction in that case, between in-task and pre-task work. Specifically thinking about the extent to which task complexity or difficulty might really matter in this case. And I can talk about that more, but moving on. We also ran a mediation analysis through this idea of rating surprise. So whether or not task uncertainty and knowledge of results, as we measured those, do they predict trustworthiness, perceived trustworthiness of this rating? And is that relationship mediated by this idea of rating surprise? And there was a significant relationship between task uncertainty and rating surprise. And it significantly mediated the relationship between task uncertainty and trustworthiness of the rating, such that the main effect dropped away entirely when running the mediation analysis. And this was done according to Hayes 2013. There's also a significant relationship between knowledge of results. So while our in-task feedback manipulation didn't predict trustworthiness, looking at knowledge of results on its own does in fact relate significantly to trustworthiness. So not necessarily causal, but a relational effect here. And also mediated through rating surprise. Importantly, these effects remain significant when controlling for performance, in this case, overall rating. So while overall rating is significantly related to trustworthiness, it does not add any additional explanatory value to trustworthiness of the rating when considered alongside rating surprise. So sometimes I know this happens back to my analogy of grade surprise. We think, oh, it's the grade that matters or the performance rating that matters. And it does. It's not irrelevant. But this idea of rating surprise, whether or not individuals were surprised negatively or positively by their rating, was actually far more significant than whether or not they received a positive or a negative rating in predicting trustworthiness. So in conclusion, minor interventions in platform design can result in changes to the perceived trustworthiness of an automated evaluation, specifically pre-task interventions can improve perceptions of trustworthiness. While algorithmically determined performance evaluations elicit different responses and response mechanisms from humans to robots and more interactive AI, transparency and trust are likely at work in both cases. Task uncertainty and knowledge of results are both significantly related to trustworthiness in this context, and rating surprise is a significant mediator of these relationships. For future work, might consider unpacking discrepant findings along the timing of these interventions, exploring further the conditions under which additional feedback and explanations might really be needed in evaluative context. Considering alternatives to trustworthiness that still focus on, that use rating surprise, but maybe look more at credibility, reliability, as was discussed earlier today, or perhaps legitimacy. And how do task demands and complexity affect the relative impact of real-time feedback interventions, given again that this experiment found no significant interaction, but some other work is suggestive that there might be an interactive effect along the lines of in a context where task complexity is high or particularly difficult, that in-task feedback might be more salient. And does this surprise offer any additional insight into situations likely to benefit from additional transparency or explanation? Whoops. Okay, finish my sharing there. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. Very nice presentation. So I have a first question picking up on something Linda Onesh said yesterday, that a missing piece of trust research sometimes is vulnerability, not in the sense of uncertainty per se, but of risk. So what do you think about your study? Do you see a way maybe including like a perception of risk? I mean, like an emotional balance of the task, for example, for participants. How could that improve or change or expand on your findings? And the second question, what about potential individual differences related to your participants' propensity to trust, but also other mechanisms that you think may be related to your study paradigm and measures?
Thanks. Great questions, both. To vulnerability, that very much is salient to this work, right? I'm situating this within a population of individuals that would be whose work would be marked by precarity. Now, the online experiment, right? Did individuals really feel a sense of vulnerability? I'm not sure about that. So that's a hope as we move forward that we would think about, is there a true risk involved? To an extent, I think they do, though. Given that this was an online platform and we're looking at gig workers, while any of these individuals might be employed full-time and non-gig work, they are in fact participating in gig work. There's a risk of payment, right? When they were in, we paid everyone who encountered technical difficulties, but that's another thing along the way you'd see in the comments. And so this is anecdotal, not validated, but that some of the individuals expressing in the experiment, expressing a lot of concern, hey, this aspect wasn't working. Am I, how is this going to affect me? Or does my performance relate to the pay I'm going to get for this experiment? Which obviously it did not in this instance. They were paid simply for their participation. But I think vulnerability would matter. I don't know that I've gotten at it. Well, I certainly didn't get at it explicitly in this study. I do think it was maybe that they were aware of it. And there's a specific, that rating surprise is trying to get at it, that it's a performance evaluation in true context, like there is a real vulnerability. So the gig worker who's receiving that 3-star or 4-star rating, and again, consider these instances where a 4-star rating is considered failure. There's real vulnerability if you're getting anything other than a maximum kind of rating in these algorithms. One of the papers I referenced on a slide, Atim Ratman, has a situation where he looks at gig workers in a platform that had a relatively transparent rating system for workers, and then it became very opaque. So through the context of that shock, how individuals responded. And this was a qualitative work primarily, but I think something that might also point to another way to kind of look at vulnerability, that in the context of the precarity felt in these extra organizational work situations, the ways in which algorithmic determinations can be very directive of one's work persistence ability. I think it's relevant. I don't know that I got at it explicitly, but it's very much a concern and interest moving forward of how vulnerability plays out, certainly as it relates to trust and trustworthiness. And the second question about potential individual differences, I don't think I mentioned it in my personal notes or my individual notes on that last slide. It actually was one of the sentences there. So yes, I think it's important. One thing I don't talk about here is there is a significant relationship along binary sex or gender, male, female in my study. And so that often, like when there's this significant gender effect, a lot of times that might be an individual difference along one of the big two or big five kind of dimensions. And so I would be interested in thinking about how certain individual differences, conscientiousness, for instance, might be one that changes the way individuals respond to in-task or pre-task feedback, right? Thinking a conscientious individual, for instance, who received a low uncertainty or high clarity pre-task expectations might not really need any in-task feedback. They're thinking they're very aware of what they're doing. They received good detail about how to do this task. The task isn't overly complex. Whereas when you start adding more information, maybe that detracts or raises new concerns. So that's just a hypothetical, not something I've looked at, but an area that I might go. I do think it would be relevant. So thanks. Does that answer those two questions, at least in part?
But now I was wondering, what about adaptive feedback, for example, like adapting the feedback to each individual preferences for feedback? When and how do we prefer to receive feedback to make feedback trustworthy in the sense that it fits your needs?
Yeah, that's I don't have an answer for you, but that's a direction our group is trying to go. We're trying to develop, using this platform to develop ways, and I see Andrew's here as well, but essentially using this platform to develop ways in which feedback might become more adaptive, right, and or individually customized to see how that changes. So whether it's individual factors that are trying to individually customize or kind of broadly looking at what kind of inputs are we receiving from individuals, and then what kind of output do we know we need to provide. So that's an area we're trying to move.
Yeah, so please let us know if you're going to...
We'll follow up, right?
Yes. Any other questions from the others? Yes, John, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks for that. So I have a quick, just clarificatory question, and then I have a sort of somewhat more critical question. So the clarificatory question is just, I think you had it on a slide. What was the question that you were asking people to answer when it comes to trustworthiness? Was it like, how accurate do you think this rating is? And
yeah, let me pull up the exact word here. So there was one was a 3-item. I didn't put up all 3 items for that. Mm-hmm. But the single item was specifically the algorithmic calculation, because that's how it was presented to them, was a algorithmic rating calculation. The algorithmic calculation provided an accurate overall rating of my caregiving performance during the simulation. So that was the single item measure, which was drawn from Lee 2018, which again, trustworthiness, when we're talking about a rating, I think having not been able to listen to all of your talk, I could imagine some questions about, oh, we're just talking about a rating. We're not even talking about an anthropomorphized AI or robot. And so is trustworthiness the right answer?
Yeah, I mean, that's where I'm going to go with it, right? I mean, why isn't that just not accuracy? Like,
yes.
How accurate is it?
Yeah, so that's one reason I like the Thielchen-Hurst field, is it's kind of, they have this multidimensional measure that's framed around trust, but it's really credibility is what they're trying to get at here. So I called it trustworthiness, but credibility, they also refer to it as credibility scale, where it looks at trustworthiness, reliability, and authenticity are kind of the 3 features of that 3-item scale. And so you've given me good food for thought in terms of, should I be using the word trust or trustworthiness? It's part of It's certainly part of our field, but in this context, maybe part of my issue in identifying the right measure could have been that trust isn't really what we're doing when we're just looking at an evaluative rating, right? So I'm not going so far as to say it's not what we're doing with other types of agents, robots, anthropomorphized. I think there's been good discussion on that. But with a rating, maybe it's not trust, and so accuracy, reliability, credibility might be better. So that's something I'll certainly be considering in my future work.
Great. Yeah. Thanks a lot.
Yeah. Thanks to you as well for that great conversation earlier.